Dear Dr. Hicham Alaoui, dear friends, I have the great pleasure and honor as President of Sciences Maroc, first of all, to welcome you all to this conference and to thank you all for your presence and for your interest in the subject on which we are going to focus today. I would also like to thank the Friends of Menton Graphie and Sciences Po TV for agreeing to cover the event, as well as the members of the administration for their help and support. Of course, I would also like to thank Dr. Hicham Alaoui for having accepted our invitation and for his desire to discuss the main ideas of his book with the students of Sciences Po Menton. Indeed, the question of the Arab Springs and democratic transitions occupies a central place in the modern history of the Arab world. While some Arab countries have experienced periods of great unrest, even civil wars, two countries, namely Tunisia and Egypt, particularly attract our attention. Indeed, the authoritarian regimes of Ben Ali and Mubarak were overthrown. Their democratic transitions were initially successful. Thus, questions arose for the Democrats. What place for Islamist parties? Should former officials of the authoritarian regime be judged? Is there a democratic Islamism? Do we need a secular state, an Islamic state, or a civil state with Islamic references? A multitude of questions, therefore, to which the Tunisian and Egyptian Democrats have not answered in the same way. But I won't spoil the subject for you anymore and immediately give the floor to Mariam Ghani, our head of the conference center, so that we can begin Mr. Alaoui's presentation, and good conference.
Thank you, Azdin, for these words. Now I will introduce our guest of honor. Dr. Hicham Alaoui studied at Princeton, then Stanford, where he created his foundation. He also created other programs like the Good Governance and Political Reform in the Arab World at the Center of Democracy, which analyzes the different social and political dynamics within Arab countries and the possible pathways for democratic reform in these countries. Dr. Hicham Alaoui also took part in several independent initiatives concerning social issues. In 2000, he was the main community affairs advisor to the United Nations mission in Kosovo, and also became an international observer during the elections in Palestine and Nigeria in the early 2000s. But I will not be able to list everything, so I will focus on the conference topic. Your acute interest for democracy, Dr. Hicham Alaoui, in the Arab countries led you to write a book recently named Pacted Democracy in the Middle East, focusing on two countries, Egypt and Tunisia. So thank you for agreeing to our invitation in Menton, and we are honored to welcome you on our campus today to talk with you and to have an exchange. I will now let you begin this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these most kind introductions. I am certainly very pleased, very honored to be among you. And I will try within 45 minutes to give you the essence or the most important takeaways of this book, which is a modest contribution to the debate, but it, I think, or I hope, is a concrete contribution to the debate. Thank you again to all of you. Thank you again to the organization of students that has invited me. Thank you again to to those administrators and those personalities and figures of Sciences Po Sciences Po Menton who have welcomed me amongst you on this beautiful campus. Without delay, I will just say one very brief remark about to whom this book is offered. This book is offered to the young activists and militants and intellectuals of this region that will carry on henceforth the torch of the desire for emancipation, advancing democracy and human rights in our region. For me, there's an important distinction here between a biological generation and a political generation. The first phase of the Arab uprising, Arab Spring, call it whatever you may, call it whatever you want to call it, has shown its limits, has clearly not gone through the whole cycle, but there will be other waves. And I think we are dealing more with a political generation rather than a biological generation. A biological generation being 25 years. I don't think this is a case of May 68, where the values of May 68 will come later on after a whole generation. I think this is a shorter time frame and episode, in which case brothers will have seen what their elder brothers and sisters have done and will be inspired by them. I will, for the purposes of being expedient and gaining a little time, I will explain the bullet points as they will appear in front of you, in front of the sides, and I will let you go through them and read them, and I will read only those bullet points which I think are essential, so bear with me, please. So, Islam democracy debate. Regretfully, the question of democracy has basically boiled down in our region to the nexus Islam and democracy, whether Islam is compatible with democracy. In essence, the Orientalist trope have basically taken hostage the debate, and everything is seen through that prism. And all other theses and all other ideas are basically, essentially subverted or sucked into this vortex, which is highly reductionist. As you well know, the most eloquent and the most vocal voice that argues skeptically about the compatibility of secularism and Islam and the aversion of Islam to democratization is Bernard Lewis, an eminent historian of Princeton who has produced very, very robust books, which were, in my view and in the view of many specialists of the region, reductionist, for reasons we will talk about in a few minutes. Then you have, on the other side of the spectrum, optimists. And I've just used, for the purposes of illustration here, one named Abdelaziz Sachadina, who argue that one must interpret Islamic traditions in many ways, and there are ways in which one can interpret them. And if one does that properly, scripture and canonical readings will produce a more open congruence between liberal democracies, or the path towards liberal democracies, and faith. I've only used one name here, but there are other eloquent names, other names that have spoken eloquently on the subject. Others would fall in this category, of course, are Muhammad Arkoun, others would be Wa'il Hallaq, and so forth. You know all these names. Anyone who is interested in history of the region, the history of ideas, would surely recognize those views. In essence, there's a wide spectrum of views within this field, and it essentially focalizes on reinterpreting the canonical text and the scriptural, i.e. the hadith and the Quran, or rather in that order, the Quran and the hadith, and giving more attention to something which is understudied, namely the ethical life of the Prophet and the ethical dimension found within Islam. Let me clarify my position, and my position is a bit not different, but it's well within that spectrum, yet it occupies a succinct pole or position within that spectrum. I think there are limits, and enormous limits, to comparing the Islamic tradition with the Christian and Western tradition. In essence, the Islamic experience is different. And in classical Islam, as the bullet point says, political power and religious authority overlapped, but were never fused into a single institution after the Prophet. So it is very different than the whole secular paradigm in Christianity. In Christianity, or rather in Islam, to begin with it, you have, if you will, an axis. You have a whole space. Consider my right hand being the x-axis, and my left hand being the y-axis. Here you have mu'amalat, or you have the spectrum of societal and institutional relationships. On the vertical axis, you have the relationship with God or worshiping. So that whole plane occupies the whole combinations between the two, between the mu'amalat and the ibadat. In that whole space, political power never exercised control over that space. It is the ulama, the jurists of Islam jurisprudence, that could deliberate over that axis. And everybody within a society or the caliph had to respect the ulama's edicts and fatwas. And the ulama's edicts and fatwas were autonomous. And they were essentially based on their competence and on the tools to interpret scripture and canonical hadith. So in a sense, the caliph or the executive power never had authority over that field. This is why in Islam you have nothing called orthodoxy. You have orthopraxis, but it's not orthodoxy. It's different than in Christianity. And that is an important distinction to keep. Our first contact with secularism comes with the domination of the West, with the rise of the West in confronting the region of the East, in confronting the Orient. So it's a very different set of notions and principles that are at play here. So build on that. This is my positions. My position is as follows. As presently framed, the Islam and democracy nexus is a question of theology that will take generations to resolve. We will never be able to resolve that situation. Is Islam compatible to democracy? If we do that, essentially we will never finish debating that question, and we will go in circles, and we'll always come back to the original point. In the meantime, there is real life situations in which politics comes to the forefront and imposes itself on society, and hence imposes the necessity to create another paradigm. And the best example of that, of course, is the Arab Spring, that has forced itself, or has entered by eruption and infraction, into the public sphere and into the forefront, and hence we have a situation. The Arab Spring is here, people are in the streets, people are calling for change. What do? We start deliberating about whether Islam is compatible with democracy or not? Or do we advance and build institutions and go forth? This is why I say politics is before theology. And just a note of caution here. Theology, I mean fiqh. Theology in Islam and in the history of the Islamic world, or the Islamic tradition, is essentially elaborated by Ahl al-Kalam. Ahl al-Kalam are jurists that have debated issues about Iman, that have debated issues about the existence of the divine, and so forth. The tradition of Kalam has more or less disappeared, and so for lack of a better word, in order for a Western audience to understand this kind of work, we use the word theology, which is a loose translation. So here are the basic elements to our puzzle. In the Arab Spring, we've seen it all. Your colleagues and your student friends have, and especially Mr. Lahlou has articulated this idea. We have the Arab Spring, we have people in the streets, we have regimes that are tittering, some have fallen, some are basically hanging, and the question is posed, what do we do when regimes suffer breakdowns? How do we go forward? And one of the important assumptions, one of the most salient assumptions that is posited in this book, is that during the transition, or the moment of transition, at the political moment, two forces confront each other, Islamists and secularists, and each has an incompatible view with the other concerning the future. Of course, Islamists want the Dawla al-Madaniyya, meaning the civil rights, the secularists, And Islamists want Dawlat Hakimiyat Allah, where the rules of Sharia basically take the forefront and infuse public life, infuse institutions, and everything else. This, for me, is an important assumption, and this is, for me, the salient cleavage that will emerge in any transition. Post-Ben Ali, Tunisia, and post-Mubarak Egypt are seminal cases. Why? Because they happen at the same time. Remember, when I was writing this book, when I was researching this book, it was around beginning 2013-14, and at that time there were only the two countries that made it through essentially and stayed intact are Tunisia and Egypt. There were, of course, other examples of transitions, but there were situations that led to regime demise and basically to failed statehood, failed states like in Yemen or Syria or in Libya, and they are due to a slew of problems. Some are due to confessionalism, others are due to geopolitics and so forth, but this reinforces the idea why I chose the case studies of Tunisia and Egypt. And above all, one made it through to the level of post-electoral democracy, and the other, Egypt, basically has almost made it and then basically failed, and then we have seen the military come in and interrupt the experience. So I proposed, or at the time I did not propose, at the time I went back to transitology, to the study of transitions of the third wave. And for those of you who specialize in political science here at, as the Americans would say, at Sciences Po, at Sciences Po, you probably know Huntington's theory about third wave democratization. Essentially, he posits that after 1974, there is a third wave of democratization that assaults or that takes center stage in the world. And we've seen a number of transitions happen within its framework, and it's in essentially Latin America, they are in Africa, and there are a few maybe in Asia. South Korea could be considered one. So these adopted a mechanism or adapted a pathway via pacting. I'll explain a little bit what it is. Pacting refers to negotiated bargains between two rivals. Now, in the context of the third wave democratization, the pact or the bargaining contracts were between leftists and regimes and the right. Essentially, the right was represented by the army. Okay, and the left essentially by the syndicates, civil society, and all sorts of political parties. Because remember, Latin America was a case of the restoration of democracy. The military had come and suspended the experience, but they were before more than rudiments. They were successful experiences of transition in the past. Now, I said to myself, wait a second. It's a little bit different. Left and right divide is about ideas, is about the presence of the state essentially within economies, and hence to what degree markets will be installed rather than centrally planned economy. But why, given that this is a political conflict between two parties that occupy different places of the spectrum, why couldn't this be applied to the Islamists, to the divide between Islamists and secularists? It's not economic, it's political, it's ideational. It's about a normative vision of the future. And before I go into my own tentative conclusions, because they're very tentative at this stage, although they're very well, with all modesty, very well researched, let me just say this. In this scheme of things, elections, institutions, and democracy arise after people sit around the table in the pacting process and determine that the least worst option is to talk, is to craft an agreement between you and your adversary. It's the least worst because sometimes the stakes, in most of the cases, the stakes are very high. That can be about the guarantee of self-preservation as opposed to the assurance of mutual demise. This is the context of pacting. Pacting happens in order to minimize the worst case scenario, which for political actors can be demise. So let's go about. Now, these are just very few examples. And these are emblematic examples of pacts during the third wave of democratization, Huntington's third wave of democratization, and I've chose 3 for you, but of course one could have gone, there are others that can be referred to. The first one, of course, is between South Africa, between Nelson Mandela, which you see, and Frederick de Klerk. Both have pacted, they have sat down, and they agreed to conduct a transition when it was clear that the regime, the continuity of the regime, of the apartheid regime, was not viable anymore, and they decided essentially to sit down and craft an agreement that would begin the transition. Second slide here is of Pinochet, and the transition begins in '79. Now this is an emblematic transition. Why? Because it's the only transition I can think of, unless I'm wrong, in which the process of institutionalization begins before the pact. Indeed, Pinochet thought he could win a referendum which he instigated. The left called his bluff. I think it was Eduardo Frei that was heading the opposition then, called his bluff, and they won the 1979 referendum. So the transition was inaugurated by an institutional consultation, a consultation in the form of a referendum, and then came the pacts, and then came the transition, the institution, and so forth. And of course, we have Franco's, the photo of Franco and Juan Carlos, and this is a very emblematic transition because it implies many things. First of all, it's in the heart of Europe, and it influenced many other transitions, which we call of Southern Europe. Namely, it influenced Greece, it influenced Italy, which was already, had already begun its transition, and it influenced, of course, Portugal. It is the example, and it involved a restoration of monarchy. This is a transition between authoritarianism and the left. It's not about the monarchy. The monarchy has been essentially restored with the pact. Now, very briefly, pacts can begin secretly or they can become open. They can begin through an open process of deliberation. Usually they're secret, but the Spanish case was essentially one that is open. The Pacto de la Moncloa, from the name of the royal palace in which it happened, basically had a secretariat that would organize and convene pacts and deliberate over these things. Now, how do pacts occur? Very quickly, crisis comes, the situation becomes untenable for the regime, and the regime is teetering on the edge of demise. And what happens is softliners in the regime, usually the military institution, the softliners will pact with the moderates on the side of the opposition. In the case of South Africa, for example, in all the cases, the extremists or those with radical demands are essentially squeezed out of the pact. Pik Botha, which was essentially the porte-d'étendard of the apartheid regime, was not consulted for the pact, as you know, and so were the communist figures in Spain, but they, of course, when the pact opens and when the process opens up, other people come to the table. Now, how do pacts work? I'm going to concentrate now. I want you to watch this second bullet point. Okay, we'll return to Islamists after. You can read these bullet points as I speak. You guys being from Sciences Po or very fast. Okay, so there are 3 conditions. And this, I'm not reinventing the wheel. This is a theory elaborated by 2 people that has since become, this theory has since become essentially enshrined into transitology and is very much accepted as being one of the cornerstones of this theory. Now, 3 conditions are necessary for a pact, or 3 conditions induce political actors in a moment of crisis to enter into pacts. 1 is acute ideological polarization. That is, the more political parties, the more the adversaries are polarized, the more there's a necessity for a pact to occur. Acute polarization does not mean severe polarization. There is a degree beyond which the polarization leads to civil war, leads to violence. I will only refer you to Algeria, the FIS and the army, or Guatemala. Beyond a certain point, severe differences will lead to violence. Parity of power between rivals. The more parity there is between rivals, the more inducement, the more the encouragement for pacting. And of course, normative dissension. Now, normative dissension is a hard concept to grapple, but think about it. If you and I, or if you and any one of you in this room and his neighbor agree on democracy as being the way out and being the aspirational model you want for your society, but you may not necessarily agree on how to go about it. You may want a centralized state, your neighbor may want a more federalized state. You may think that the institutional design is around proportional representation. He may think it's about an institutional design that centers around first party to hit the post, as they say. Now, normative dissension can be a very, very powerful obstacle to any accords, and hence they do constitute an important impetus for pacting. So this theory has been elaborated, pacting theory has been elaborated by Philip Schmitter and Guillermo O'Donnell. And in fact, all my political interest in pact comes from the day when I was a student 25 or 30 years ago in Stanford with Philip Schmitter. Don't worry, je ne suis pas un ancien combattant, mais je suis un vétéran. Okay, I am not yet over the hump, but I am certainly a veteran of these things. Now, let's look ahead. And pre-pacting conditions are important. Why? Because pre-pacting conditions, if political actors interiorize the deadlock, if they interiorize the deadlock, then they are more ready for pacting the day this happens. When they've confronted each other, they've confronted their political adversary. Before the regime demise, they understand that at the end of the day, there's no way around their political differences except through negotiations. This is the ideal situation. Now, political pacts and the 3 criteria we talked about just now, they are inducements and encouragements to pacting, but they are not the entire story. The entire story depends also on the structural parameters of each country. Do I have sustained economic growth in a certain country? If I do, then the pacting operation becomes easier, and the higher the success toward democracy. 2, do I have inequalities? The more the inequalities, the harder it is for democracy to take root. 3, past legacies of civil war. If there is a past civil war, ethnic crises, ethnic divides, these will create disadvantages for the future of an aspiring democracy. So there are the criteria, and then there are the structural parameters which will help a country, or which will facilitate the transition to democracy. So here I want you to begin with reading the second point. Now you can tell me, it's been 20 years since, 20 years since the last transition, pacted transition happened. Well, there is, of course, bargaining in every democratization. There is a moment of bargaining. But the formal pact, as you refer to, has basically ceased to exist in 20 years, to the degree that you had to exhume, like an archaeologist, this old theory and adapted to the Islamist secularist divide. So what happened in 20 years? What other modes of transitions were there? Well, I'll evoke one. It's colored revolutions. Colored revolutions took place essentially in Eastern Europe. And that involves people coming out in the street and just doing away with the old regime. But why did that happen? That happened because the regimes that were facing the streets were essentially regimes that had a close ideological and political proximity to Moscow, to the old USSR. And once the old party in Moscow collapsed and the Soviet Empire collapsed, they had no source of revenue, there was no help, and there was no ideological example, and there was no political support coming from Moscow. And hence, they were bankrupt. What did they do? These regimes knew colored revolutions. And this was the biggest mistake, or the biggest fallacy, I think, was that we subsumed or conflated the Arab Spring uprisings with colored revolutions. They are not colored revolutions. They are a completely different phenomena. The colored revolution relates or is tied to the legacy of the Cold War. Arab regimes, I will contend, are more hegemonic autocracies. They will not go away easily. Why? Because their elites hold power as a result of the legacies of the end of colonial state and post-colonial construction of the state. The Algerian army has constructed the Algerian state, and hence it is very well entrenched. It was just not going to leave. The Moroccan monarchy has been here before the colonial state, and essentially it's been strengthened by the emergence of the modern state. So while one is a legacy of the Cold War, these Arab regimes are essentially legacies of a different set of historical circumstances. So we must be careful not to conflate the two. So what happens in these regimes? After the uprising, given it's not a color revolution, elites stay lurking in the background and they wait for the opportune moment to come back to the forefront. The old regimes that have essentially occupied power and have essentially discredited themselves, they exit the scene. But the old elites will always reorganize and come back to the forefront. This, for me, is essentially another assumption, which is about regime or transition dynamics from regime collapse or from the rupture, the political moment, to the moment of institutionalization. You have a revolutionary rupture and the deposal of the leader. That would be considered for the point of departure, for example, with the departure of Ben Ali or the demise of Hosni Mubarak. Then you have an intractable conflict between the two forces, Islamists and secularists. Remember that when the regime goes of Ben Ali or Mubarak, everybody was in the street. And in fact, these transitions or these upheavals were not led by Islamists or advocates of the civil states. They were led by youth like you calling for the instauration of democracy and the respect of human rights. Then you have a moment of conflict, and then you have bargains that begin between the Islamists and the political and the secularists. Then you have new institutions. Now, these are pact involves opposition forces, not the regime. This is an important aspect to name. It is not the regime that goes into pacting. It is not the regime that finds itself in difficulty or parts of the old state that remain intact that goes into pact. This is the difference with Latin America, and this is another of my assumptions. And it can be supported and bolstered by the empirical evidence. The pacts in Latin America are about extrication. The regime wants to extricate itself. The military have lost, and it wants to extricate itself. It wants to go back to its barracks. It wants to make sure that the rights of the officers, economic positions, and economic postures, and that its well-being remains intact, but that it has then it's one about intrication. Here, the regime wants to stay in power. It wants to replicate itself through new elites and wants to stay in power. And the pacting is about power sharing for the future. It is not about only self-survival and mutual survival. It is physical survival. It's about staying alive and staying in politics. That's the difference. One last thing very briefly. While this is a dynamic, there can be several iterations to this. There can be another iteration. That is, we can reach to power institutions, then we can hit another deadlock at a certain moment of the transition, and then we're forced again. The fault lines comes up to the surface again. We've seen that in the Tunisian example. We'll go, the fault line, the conflict between Islamists and secularists came to the forefront many times, and they had to bargain many times. So this loop can circulate more than once. Well, more than twice, it's become unhealthy. That means that the process is frozen. But it's not uncommon to see basically two complete circles. The Brazilian transition from the moment the army leaves to basically the departure of the color, which was the president, which was a candidate of the army, took essentially 10 to 15 years. That's called protracted transition. Okay, so I will, this is what happened in Tunisia, and I will talk about this. I have another 10 minutes. I will take 7 minutes for this and talk 3 minutes for regarding Tunisia. Now, again, this is in broad brushstrokes. A transition is characterized by conflict. It's characterized by contentious events in the streets. It's more than characterized. It is darted by these things. Confrontations happen every day between secularists and Islamists, and between civil society and the state and the police. Transitions are very fluid and they are very messy, and sometimes it's extremely hard to recognize what's happening. But briefly, I've put this canvas for you. This is an outline, and then we will put some of the meat on it. So Ben Ali leaves, opposition emerges, and it operates in the form of a Nahda, CPR, and Takattul. Very briefly, Nahda is the Islamist political movement, and CPR and Takattul are the secularist parties that are in the transition. Now, this happens in 2011. The first thing that happens, and it happened also in Egypt, is that all political parties do not pact in the beginning. And there's not conflict. Everybody coalesces together. Everybody coalesces together. Everybody coalesces together. And why? They coalesce together in the first instant because they fear the return of the old regime. The black sheep here is a return of the old regime. And it becomes essentially the lightning rod that everybody has to avoid. So 2010, that's exactly what happened. The Tunisians create this instance pour la survie des objectifs de la révolution, something like that. Excuse me, my memory fails me on the exact appellation. Nevertheless, this is the instance that was created. It was supposed to lead to an election on the National Constitutive Assembly. The Tunisians did this very methodically. They went top down and they built their institutions one by one. Everything was built from scratch while using, of course, by resting on the state. And this was truly something brilliant. So Tunisians do that, and the first elections of the NCA, National Constituent Assembly, which was then supposed to enact through various mechanisms the advent of a new constitution and of a new parliament. Ghannouchi and his political parties win. We are in October 2011. He wins. All of a sudden, Tunisians realize that the principal force in the country is the Islamists. Where did they come from? How did they do it? That was a big question. Anyways, they won. Now, We're here, we're at this entry here. In 2012, political conflict becomes acute. You have on the one side the Islamists, and on the other side you have the secularists. The Islamists have three demands. One, that Islam be at the center of the next constitution, that they be a deliberate and explicit a reference to Sharia. Three, that there be no place for blasphemy, that blasphemy should be reprehensible by the penal code and legally. And also, last but certainly not least, that women be given the role or be assigned a role of complementary role within the society. All these demands, of course, did not fly for the secularists. They wanted no reference to Islam, no Sharia, no blasphemy, and they wanted women to be the equals of men. So, extraordinary conflict, polarization to the point of derailing the transition. And then what happens at the end of 2012? The end of 2012, the Islamists cede on all these points. They cede on blasphemy. They cede on the Article 1 of the Constitution. They keep a reference to Islam, but it's very general and ambiguous in the Constitution. And it was essentially the first article of Bourguiba's Constitution, so they kept that. And also, lastly, and just as importantly, they finally abandoned their demand that the women play a complementary role to men. So I'm going to ask you this question. Why is it that a political party or a political actor that has won everything electorally and through democratic means will cede on matters that are essentially its raison d'être? The reason is simple. Self-preservation and preventing self-destruction and the mutual destruction of everyone. Because it was clear that even if they had won, this is something they could not impose on the rest of society. Furthermore, when I did my research, I realized that President Marzouki would convene every Friday a meeting in the middle of this conflict, a meeting between all these political parties that were, they didn't have to meet, they met, they had meetings at the NCA, but they met within closed doors in the palace, presidential palace, and then they met again on Tuesday, again to see, what of their decisions of Friday were, which ones were implemented and which did not implement. That is an example par excellence of pacting, as we saw in Latin America. 2013, another conflict emerged, even after there is basically an entente and the two political actors get a breath of fresh air and move ahead with the transition. There is essentially a big crisis that emerges in 2013. The Salafis enter into the political sphere, and there is the murder of two political activists which are killed by Salafis. We were to know afterwards, but it was clear for many, it was pretty, they thought it was self-evident that these were murdered by Islamists. And then you began again. The Islamists would say, look, we've conceded on everything. And the secularists would say, no, you didn't concede on everything. You only deferred the advent of your Islamic State. So you did not concede, you deferred only. Islamists again would say the same thing. Enter the quartet in 2000 and in March 2013. The quartet enters and it structures the pact as what happens again in most of Latin America. There is a national dialogue animated by the quartet. So you see the pact being more institutionalized between these actors, like what you saw in other countries. 2013, at the end of 2013, the Islamists do several things. While the identity crisis was created, there was still a political element to dimension to this conflict between Islamists and secularists. And here, Ghannouchi and the Islamists concede territory on this. What do? They essentially, number one, they ban all the Salafist groups. So They can no longer be accused of harboring a Trojan horse that will come back into the electoral system through the Salafists. 2, they accept, and this is very important, they accept a semi-presidential system. Islamists everywhere in the region have a tendency to want parliamentarian systems and not presidential systems, because they know that Islamist candidates at the level of presidency have a propensity not to win these elections due to a variety of reasons we will not go into. And lastly, and just as importantly, Ghannouchi leaves the government and says, I will leave the government and I will give this to a caretaker government which we'll agree on, and we will meet afterwards for the real electoral condition. So this is what happens essentially. On the political grounds, after the identity issues, now Ghannouchi and the Islamists concede on the basis of the political arena. Now, why would they do that? Again, there is no explanation for that. Only the fact that, one, scared of mutual demise. Remember very well that in the summer of 2013, the military had already stepped in Egypt, and for all the Maghrebis, including the Tunisians, including also the Moroccans, which didn't know any transition, but still they were petrified by the specter of Algeria, and everybody had in mind the specter of Algeria. Ghannouchi wanted absolutely to avoid the Algerian scenario. 2, Tunisia was winning in the terms, in the form of support and international legitimacy, since everyone saw it as the only success story of the Arab Spring. So these were supplementary inducements for the pact. Come 2014, remember our little schematic. The two secularist groups, Al-Nahda and CPR, CPR and Takatul, lose the election that is in early 2014. They lose it, and who wins? Nidaa Tunis. Nidaa Tunis is essentially becomes essentially the new party harboring the old elites of Ben Ali. Beji Qaid Sibsi wins 2014 after the new constitution is adopted and so forth. He wins the election. And when he wins the election, what does he do? He says, I'm not going to form a government alone. I'm going to go into a coalition, a political coalition with Al-Nahda. I'm going to go into a political coalition with Al-Nahda. Why does Nidaa Tunis, which is a secularist group, and you know the animosity between these two political poles, why would he do that? Simple. Again, simple, no. Complicated, but rather evident. That's what I mean. Obvious, politically obvious. He's scared of the political, of the fear of alienating an important political actor as in Algeria. And hence, still in the transition, and the transition must be inclusive, this is where another pact is built, this time between the remnants of the old regime and the Islamists. And Al-Nahda comes into the cabinet government and manages the second part of the transition. So this is pacting, a successful case of pacting. Now, this is all the meats and bones of the argument I went through with you. I will not take more time on these two. This is a very, very dear picture to me. It's Ghannouchi and Beji Qaid Sibsi meet for the first time after the death of Shukri Bilaid. This picture is taken in March 2013 at the height of the tension between the two. It takes place in a political meeting my foundation, our foundation organized, and we were essentially, if you can say, civil society that has encouraged this after that the quartet has encouraged. So I'm very honored by having played a minute but important role. Now, we cannot talk about Tunisia without evoking what is happening right now. There is backsliding, it's not a question. But the backsliding, I will say, it is due to the emergence of populism. Now, Qais Said comes to power, he instaurs what we call a form of populism, and populism ala Qais Said is basically the same populism, or resembles the populisms we see elsewhere. It's essentially saying political parties are corrupt, elites are corrupt, we are the people, and I represent the people, and I will install direct democracy, and I will do away with representative democracy. Essentially, I will do away with the parliament, I will do away with all structures of intermediation, and I will keep only direct referendums, and I will keep only the direct consultation with the people. That is the playbook of populism. And the essentially, again, the quintessential example of populists is Viktor Orban, which even Trump and the right everywhere where populism takes hold is emulating. So this, we cannot ignore this, but it's important to distinguish. Is this a failure of the transition? No, it's not a failure of the transition. It's not a failure of the transition because Tunisia had become, before the backsliding, a clear-cut example of electoral democracy. So essentially, it is a failure of the consolidation of democracy. It is not a failure of the transition to democracy. The transition, the pacting has worked. It has led to a transition process that has created institutions, but these institutions have not been protected, due to a variety of reasons, some of which are economic and due to the lack of help of the West and the neglect of the West, but also due to too much elite playing, too much elite, too much elite intimacy, deals and bargains. Again, we cannot factor this out, but we must explain, or at least I explain, what is attributable to this backsliding. Last but not least, contrary to many, I think still the story is not finished. That given that the scaffolding of democracy is still there, that sooner or later this popular movement will know an important revival. Now we go to Egypt very quickly, and this is with which I will end my presentation. Here, the Mubarak regime exits, and you have opposition emerging in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood and the secularist civil states. Now, again, like in Egypt, like in Tunisia, the opposition coalesces very quickly, gets together under the harboring of the military, again, from fear of a return of the old regime, from fear of seeing Mubarak come back from Saudi Arabia on a private plane, so they all get together, and there's no conflict early on, until, of course, something happens which is basically marks a contrast with Tunisia. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood decide to ram a constitution down the throats of everybody, and with the help or with the complicity of the military. That constitution essentially preserves the place of Islam with an explicit reference to Sharia, the explicit desire to put a reference to the civil state in the constitution has been essentially eliminated, and the military maintain their prerogatives and their enclaves of military sovereignty within the constitution through essentially 11 articles. That's the first instance of failure of initial pacting. So, initial pacting between Muslim Brotherhood and the civilian advocates leads to failure because of the imposition of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood that went to the Muslim Brotherhood, or rather, the imposition of the military of Mubarak and not of the military rather than the Islamists, and the complicity of the Islamists. 2012, the constitution is hastily adopted. Then, on the heels of that, there is an election that takes place in November of 2012. Remember that that election exercise was very convoluted, it was very complicated, and did not culminate until a final tour, a final round in January of 2013. And by then, it was clear that the Muslim Brotherhood had won. They won a democratic election, but one in which there was not consensus, and there was anything but consensus. And in fact, people were aggrieved, and it was extremely egregious political process. Then comes to, in my advice, I see a second moment of pacting in 2013, January 2013, where instead of the Islamists saying, well, now we won, let's ensure that no one is alienated in this process, and let's pact with our secularist counterparts, they do not do that. By then, as classical was bound to happened. The Egyptian military became extremely suspicious of the Muslim Brotherhood because they had accumulated enough power. In 2013, in June 2013, the Islamists committed another suicidal act, namely they have fielded a candidate in the person of Morsi to run the election, whom he won, when at the moment when they had promised not to field a candidate. Remember, Ghannouchi made a promise not to run for the presidential election, and the Islamists of Al-Nahda did not field a candidate. And that was an important distinction with Egypt. He wins an election, in July 2013, the military are totally panicked, and they see the presidency and the parliament within the hands of Islamists. At that point, they issue a decree. They force the judiciary to annul the victory, or to annul the parliament that was already sieging in March of 2013, that is March of that year. The Islamists react, and Morsi issues essentially a decree saying that all elections, that all presidential decrees trump everything else that can come from any other institution. So basically, he acts as Caesar in Egypt, and at that time, everybody, of course, the system was polarized, and everybody was doubting everybody else. The military essentially step in 2013. You know the rest of the story. It's interrupted. Now, again, this is the same. This is the meats and the flesh on the skeleton. Let me go to the one conclusion I want you to remember, and it's this one, the last one. Why did the transition in Egypt fail? Only through the prism of the three criteria we talked about. It's because there was ideological polarization between Islamists and secularists. There was normative diversity. There was plenty of it. In fact, it created a lot of fragmentation, but there was no parity. Why there was no parity? One, because Islam was very well entrenched in the society as a whole, not like Tunisia. For a variety of historical reasons, we can talk about them during the Q&A. And also, there was an important factor here, which is the military. Now, you could tell me, and I know some of you here are very strong in terms of methodology, well, we're comparing oranges and apples. Why are we comparing oranges and apples? Because we're talking about a military here which had tutelary power over the entire system. Then your pacting does not work. I say no. The military, in fact, was a tutelary power, that's for sure. But once the transition began, the military was forced into a corner. It had the power, of course. It was a kingmaker more than any other place, but it did take a secondary role. And in fact, what came out to the forefront was a discussion between the Islamists and the secularists. And had the Islamists not monopolized the power in the way they did, and had they played more intelligently and more subtly, and essentially pacted and governed together in the first instance of the transition with the secularists, the military would have had a hard time intervening. It would have been impossible to intervene. So no, in my opinion, the military did not set up everybody so that they would lose and they would come and gain power. The military saw the errors and capitalized on the errors of everyone and finally interrupted the exercise. Now, last slide, I promise you, and these are the key theoretical concepts which this book essentially finds, and I'd like you, this is a takeaway I'd like you to get away with. I've just talked about the tutelary example, so even in the presence of a tutelary actor, still this Islamist and secularist party will come up to the surface. Whether there is a military like in Algeria, a monarchy eventually in the process of an eventual or ultimate transition, whether in democratic transition, whether in Jordan or Morocco, at the end of the day, it is that pacting, salient pacting fracture which is of relevance here. And first, pacts between Islamists and secularists are not about extricating dictators from power. They're about organizing power sharing, which is different. Revolutionary dynamics, I talked about it. Elites reorganize after the demise of the regime. And last takeaway, important takeaway, successful pacts have nothing to do with prior secularism, prior Islamism, Islamic tradition or culture, but rather the institutional conditions in which Islamists and secularists engage one another as relative equals. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.